Good morning and welcome to the Point. This past week, the presidential campaign came to Michigan, at least virtually, as we talked with former Vice President and presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden. First of all, Mr. Vice President, thank you for doing this. I know this is an unusual campaign, and I want to talk about that in a minute, but you've been rolling out some of your priorities, and you're calling it Build Back Better. And you've already talked about manufacturing. I talked with Chairman Perez about that last week. I know today you're talking about building a workforce for childcare and early childhood education. Tell me how that might work and what it would mean for a place like Michigan.
Well, what it means for a place like Michigan, an awful lot of working people are really struggling to have to pay for childcare or, if they're working, or taking care of an elder parent or someone with a disability. So what we provide for, we've gone to the economists, they've indicated that we could probably create between 3 and 5 million jobs in two ways. The first thing is to go out and we would make sure that, for example, right now there are 800,000 people waiting to get access to, through Medicaid, access to home health care and or community health care and for elderly people. And the fact is that what we do is we're going to provide money for the states to be able to come up with ideas as to how they would in fact provide for help without having to institutionalize those people. And there's 28 cities in a bunch of states we went into and found out that what we could do is if you send in a nurse, if you send in essentially a carpenter, handyman, and you send in someone who can in fact analyze what's wrong, they found out that if mom has Alzheimer's, you can't cure Alzheimer's, but what you can do is you can prevent her from breaking her hip by making sure they put handrails wherever are needed for mom. You can make sure she's in a position where she's able to deal with the basic needs that she has. And it shows when you do that, when you bring those folks in, it costs about $3,000, but it saves over $30,000. I believe that's the number. And making sure that because it eliminates hospitalization, a whole range of other costs. And the same way with childcare. Right now, I believe if we should be able to go on, be able to go on a website that is in your state, find out where the child care facilities are, making sure that no one would have to pay more than 7% of their income for child care, even if it's more than one child. And those who in fact are on the short side of income, they would pay nothing. This would create two things. One, it put an awful lot of people who cannot go to work because they have to stay home with the child. And I was a single parent for 5 years. It's not easy. And to stay home with the child and or someone who is taking care of a parent or a grandparent or someone with special needs and they can't go to work. Secondly, what happens is you'll free up millions of them to be able to go back to work, but also you provide work for an awful lot of home care workers and increase their pay, their ability to, in fact, work, raising the overall economic growth. Economists indicate to me that we'd be in a position where we generate significantly more growth in the GDP, more people will be making more money, paying more taxes, and it would free up over 5 million people, I think it's 5 total, to be able to both people going back to work, and because they can afford the child care, they can afford the care for their parents, and those people who are caring for them.
Mr. Vice President, the last time you and I talked in person was March 9th. Since then, you have been doing a lot of virtual campaigning. Yeah. What does this look like going into the last 90 days of this race? Are you going to be able to do in-person campaigning again, or is this going to be the new norm?
Well, I hope we're going to be able to do in-person campaigning, but the way the president is dealing with this virus is making it hard to think we're going to be able to do that. You know, it's incredibly important. Your state, for example, incredibly important state. But as we're seeing with the pandemic, there are unprecedented times, and the first and foremost thing we have to do is provide for the public health. We are not putting the American people at risk. We're about leadership. This is about setting an example and leading the American people, which Donald Trump is completely failing to do. And meanwhile, we're going to continue aggressively to campaign to meet voters where they are in their homes. We have now had over, I'm told, 310 million viewers for online content that have reached millions and millions of interviews that we are viewers because of all the interviews like this one that I'm having. So I think it's going to be the new normal for a while. And it could get a lot worse if the president doesn't step up and start to lead on the virus.
You talked about Michigan being important. We reporters that cover politics look at the electoral map like reading tea leaves, and Michigan is a gateway state, particularly for a Democratic candidate. We're going to run out of time, so I'm going to combine these two questions. How important is Michigan as it plays out in your electoral strategy, and are you still considering Governor Gretchen Whitmer as a potential vice presidential candidate?
Incredibly, and yes.
Would you expand on either of those?
Well, look, Michigan is the key. The proposal I have, as you've talked about in terms of dealing with manufacturing, we're going to create 1 million new manufacturing jobs. When we were in office, we provided 79,000 new jobs, manufacturing jobs, automobile jobs in manufacturing in Michigan. We're going to own the electric vehicle market. We're going to put 550,000 charging stations in the country, all around the country. We're going to make sure that we own the electric vehicle market, and we're going to become a lot of jobs in Michigan. But look, Michigan is a state that is incredibly important, not only in terms of electoral votes, but in what it says. There's an awful lot of people that, like I grew up with in Pennsylvania and in Claymont, Delaware, that in fact are hardworking middle-class folks who deserve a shot. And my case is to the people of Michigan that, in fact, I think if they take a look at what's at stake here in this election, it's been even more clear with this pandemic and national reckoning on race. We can't afford 4 more years of Donald Trump. And so Michigan is critical for me to be able to win.
The Trump campaign was active as well. We spoke with campaign press secretary Hogan Gidley. 4 years ago, the Trump campaign did something in Michigan that hadn't been done for 24 years, won the state for a Republican nominee. Different type of campaign this year. What is your focus when it comes to Michigan?
Well, look, I think it's pretty obvious that this president's record now speaks for itself. A lot of candidates, they run on all the promises, and Donald Trump ran on the pledge he would do a lot of things for a lot of people. Thankfully, it was a promises made situation, and now it's a promises kept situation. Only in Washington, D.C. would it be unique for a politician to actually follow through on the promises they made during a campaign. I mean, you can't get by with that in Michigan. You know that. If the candidate actually does get elected and doesn't come through on the promises, they get run out of town. They get primaried, and they end up losing an election. But this president has had record-setting successes in record-setting time, and a lot of the work he's done, quite frankly, has been with the boom across this country, rising wages for the first time in 30 years, hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs coming back to this country, millions of jobs, 7 in fact, created across the United States. So it's a very impressive record. And as you know, elections are about choices. And the beauty of these types of candidates and this campaign is that you don't have to guess what the economy would look like under Joe Biden. We saw it. Depressed wages, 3.5 million jobs fleeing the United States, leaving the America we know and love and going to China. 850,000 jobs leaving just because of Joe Biden's decisions on NAFTA. So the choice is clear. If you want to have an economy that works, that allows you to put food on the table, then you need to vote for Donald Trump.
In a state that in the ensuing election went overwhelmingly Democratic, what do you have to do to convince your voters from 2016? I know you're talking about promises kept, but what does the ground game look like when you can't have those, or at least right now, aren't able to have those kind of signature rallies like we've seen all over the state and right here in Grand Rapids?
What's so impressive about this campaign is almost immediately upon entering the White House, a campaign apparatus was built, constructed to run a national system, a national organization. And so there are teams of people across this country, most assuredly in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, the 3 states that so many on the left like to talk about, because typically you see Democrats carry those states. But we have a unique candidate who made unique promises, kept those promises, and a lot of people across this country who felt forgotten for decades, under Joe Biden's policies and others, felt as though they've been ignored, felt as though they've been kicked in the teeth for 30 years in the fight with China and other countries. Jobs fleeing our shores right and left. Those are the types of distinctions we need to make in a campaign. We're doing that every single day. Of course, the president has the bully pulpit of the presidency, of the White House, of the Oval Office. He uses those every single day. In fact, I believe this evening he delivered remarks in the White House briefing room talking about coronavirus, and he's done that for the last several days, giving that information directly to the American people. Oftentimes, what you've noticed with this president is he doesn't really like the filter of the mainstream media. He likes to tell the American people directly what's going on, whether it be with a new trade deal that actually protects the American worker, getting rid of NAFTA and replacing it with the USMCA, or trade deals with Japan that protects our farmers and ranchers, buying goods that China was supposed to then didn't, and then coming in with the blockbuster historic China deal as well to protect the American worker. So time and time again, we're going to use our assets over here on the campaign. We have them across the country, both on the ground, which is always important, but also from here in Washington, D.C. to get out that message of success and prosperity and a protection of the America we know and love for future generations.
When we come back, a race that will be decided well before votes for president are cast. That's next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. The 73rd state House seat is open in Kent County since current Representative Lynn Affendulis is running for the U.S. House instead. There are 3 Republicans running for their party's nomination. We start with Brian Postumus. Let's start with your background, where you have been, what you have done up to now, and what made you decide to run for the state house now.
Absolutely. I'm a 4th generation farmer. So my degree is in agricultural business management, and I grow hops. Hops are an ingredient in the craft beer industry. And so we supply a lot of the breweries around West Michigan and throughout the Midwest with some of their ingredients. I decided to run when our governor made it a crime to go out and earn a paycheck. I feel like we need a lot more business experience in Lansing to help get Michigan back to work.
What would your approach be when you think about the pandemic that the governor's just gone through? And obviously you have some questions and concerns about the way the state was locked down for a period of time. And even as we speak now, there are concerns that with more cases going up and the percentage of infections going up, that there could be some type of rollback, if you will. How would you approach that?
I absolutely believe there were significant mistakes in the way our governor handled the lockdown. From the very beginning, we needed to take a regionalized approach and look at it from a dynamic of safe versus unsafe, as opposed to necessary versus unnecessary. And from that perspective, I mean, here in West Michigan, we're 150 miles away from 70% of the cases. A regionalized approach could have significantly changed the dynamic of how our economy was affected by this. I know from personal experience with the majority of our customers shut down due to this lockdown. We were significantly impacted as well, and I know that's a story across the board. Time and time again, I've heard from job providers that they could be open, and they would be open if they had the opportunity to. And I trust them to make the decisions that are necessary and put in the proper safety protocols that are necessary in order to do that safely. And so that's the biggest thing. As far as the statistics are concerned, of course we have an uptick in cases. We have drastically increased the number of tests that are going out. I mean, drastically increased. Not only that, but beginning of the pandemic, when testing was first getting started, people that we know had symptoms were getting turned away because they weren't in the high risk category, simply because we didn't have enough tests to go around. So of course we have an uptick in cases. The fact of the matter is the number of deaths has significantly plummeted. But again, it has to be looked at from a regional approach.
I want to shift to another issue that if you're successful in the primary and in the general, that you'll have to deal with along with 109 other members of the House, and that's the budget. Now, the budget for this coming fiscal year will already have been in place, but we know there's going to be a lot of strain on it again because so many businesses were closed down. Tax revenues suffered dramatically because of that. What's your approach when it comes to having to tighten the belt?
Well, first of all, the number one priority needs to be getting Michigan back to work, right? I mean, as we get Michigan back to work, as we have better employment numbers, then our revenues coming into the state are going to be higher, and that's why I decided to run for this seat. I have the experience needed. I'm the only candidate in the race that has a history of business ownership experience and providing jobs, and so I know how to do that.
Another of those candidates is Robert Regan. Tell me about your background, what you've done up to now, and why you decided to run for this seat.
All right. Thank you, Rick, for having me. Yes, I've been in business since I was a teenager, whether it was mowing lawns, shoveling snow, caddy at the Country Club of Lansing. And then right out of college at Indiana University, I worked for the Fifth Third Bank for about 4 years. Then I was with Morgan Stanley Dean Witter as a financial analyst and stockbroker. Then I worked as an operations research manager for a manufacturing company there in Lansing. And then I had my own manufacturing company for about 10 years. And then unfortunately, with the 08 and 09 debacle and the financial collapse, went through an unfortunate bankruptcy, lost everything, and had to start all over again. And then I was a professional recruiter, hiring a lot of medical device engineers and printed circuit board engineers for the Stryker Corporation there in Kalamazoo. And then I decided to run for state representative here in 2014 and started another business called Gray Cap Transportation, where we are responsible for the logistical moving of brand new box trucks for like UPS, FedEx, Penske, all over the country. And that's what I've been doing.
So what is your interest in this? Obviously, you've done this before. Why do you want to run for the State House?
Well, it's one of these things I've always wanted to do, Rick. And I talked to a couple of U.S. senators about 15 years ago, and I said, I'd like to get involved with politics to give back to the community and our neighbors in this great state. And I said, should I start off at the school board or township level, city council? And they said, absolutely not. The lowest rung on your ladder to start is at state representative. Well, about 15 years ago, Rick, I had small children still at home. And as you know, there's a huge time commitment when you decide to run for office. And then when you're going to be a representative of the district, it takes an awful lot of time. So the timing wasn't right. But then as my children grew up, 2014, the time was right. And as you know, I took second place to Chris Affendulis. And then in 2018, I took second place to Lynn Affendulis. So the good Lord and I had a talk and said, we're going to give it 3 times. And if third time's a charm, that's great. And I can't tell you how glad I am there's not another Affendulis running this time.
Well, what are the things you would like to accomplish if you're successful in both the primary and the general? What do you want to do if you get to Lansing?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, we'd like to really focus on our infrastructure and roads, bridges, and dams. Now that's a new one, thanks to our illustrious governor. But the other thing I'd like to do is I'd really like to see individuals being able to thrive. I believe that we need to get regulations and taxes out of the individual citizens' lives so they can either start businesses or do a better job of taking care of their own families. And I think Hillary Clinton was dead wrong. It does not take a village to raise a family. It takes a family to raise a child. And I think we need to focus more on the individual responsibility as well as the individual opportunities. And the way we do that is reducing regulations as well as the tax burden on the people of Michigan.
You talked about your experiences during the great economic downturn here in the state of Michigan in the mid-2000s, and that made for some absolutely difficult budgeting in Lansing. Now, again, after the pandemic, after the shutdown of businesses, lack of tax revenue, budgeting in Lansing again is becoming very difficult. Despite what the federal government may or may not do, that pressure is going to remain. So if you do go to Lansing in January, how do you approach that budget?
Well, Rick, as you know, Michigan is ranked number 50 out of 50 in terms of transparency on how the government is run in Lansing. So the first thing we need to do is open up the transparency level in Lansing so we can actually see where the money is going and what's going on. I can't tell you how many times we voted for tax increases to go to roads or to schools, only to find out that they never went to roads or schools. They went somewhere else. And that's something that needs to stop. And I think transparency is going to be a big impact to help fix that.
And the third running for the 73rd Republican nomination for State House is John Inhulsen. Tell me about your background, what you've been doing in your professional life, and why you decided to run for this office now.
Hi, good morning, Rick. Thanks for having me. I've lived and worked and led in this community in Grand Rapids for the past 15 years. I'm an attorney by trade. I've worked with some big law firms, and about a year ago, I started my own to focus on working with small businesses. While I've been practicing as an attorney, I've started a couple of smaller companies with some partners in town, one in the financial services area, one now in the insurance area. In addition to that, my work in the community is what really makes me most proud. I've been able to learn from quite a few leaders in town that communities don't just happen. It takes our time and our talent and our treasure to invest in and make the community like Grand Rapids what it is. I've spent time on the board of directors of Broadway Grand Rapids, helping to turn that organization around over the last 10 years. Leukemia Lymphoma Society, I was the founding chairman of the organization here in West Michigan, and that's now thriving. And several others, the East Grand Rapids Schools Foundation. I've been on the campaign cabinets of United Way and the Helen DeVos Children's Hospital when we were trying to build that here in its final stages, and several others. Back in 2015, when the downtown Christmas tree was at risk, I led a group of business leaders to make sure that was funded, and worked with the mayor of Grand Rapids and some city teams to make sure there was a public-private partnership to ensure that remains moving forward, and a host of other community-related issues. Politically, I've been involved for some time behind the scenes. Most recent publicly, I was the 2016 Kent County Republican Party chairman. And I preferred to be behind the scenes until this crisis started back in the spring. And I had to counsel so many business clients through very difficult times. And I felt that there were quite a few folks who were in Lansing not doing what I believe we could have been doing and living up to the ideals of what our government could be. So I put my hat in the ring to run.
Well, then let's find out what those ideals are. What should they have been doing in Lansing this spring, starting in March, when we first realized that this pandemic had reached the state, up until today, when we're still looking at numbers that continue to rise and some concerns that some activities could be halted again?
Absolutely. So let's talk about that. I think back when this crisis began, I'll say early March, everybody had a we're in this together perspective. The governor approached it that way. And there was trust among all the citizens in Michigan that our government was working in the right direction, as with most crises, national or state, to get in this thing together and let's get through it together. But as things have progressed into mid-April, now into May, things turned very partisan, and both sides are to blame. And but most importantly, I think the governor has failed us, but not so much in March, but in moving forward in April, May, June, and now with the latest orders, by not working with our legislature. As a people, we have three factors to our government: the executive branch, the legislative, and the judicial, as you know. The legislative is the people's voice, and there just seems to be a consistent effort not to work with the legislature. And I believe the legislature is somewhat at fault there too, making this a very partisan issue back in April instead of coming to the table. And from my perspective, we've got career politicians and special interests that have been sitting on their hands at the legislative level, really letting them be tied over the last few months instead of actively trying to sit down and work with the governor. And the governor's to blame as well. Back, not too long ago, maybe a decade or two ago, we had people who would work together on big issues across the aisle, on policy issues, but certainly on crisis issues at the national and state level. And that doesn't seem to be happening right now. And so I'm running so we can try to bring some common sense to that chaos and get people who are willing to put a hand across the aisle, sit down, and try to get things done for the people of Michigan, which should really be the focus.
The winner of the Republican primary will face Democrat Bill Saxton. And we'll be back with more To the Point. We're all out of time this week. See you next Sunday. To the Point.